Ted, welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be back.
How's it feel being on this side of the table now?
A lot less stressful. It's hard to do this job, right? Because you've got to prepare and think about questions to ask. And research the person you're talking to. I don't have to do any of that. I'm very happy about it.
You haven't researched me before the episode? Okay.
Well, I've seen your stuff, and I am so impressed with how many interviews you've done and how great they've been.
Thank you.
And I got to say, as somebody who's been involved, I really appreciate how you do it and all the folks that you've, talk to bring out some really, I think, important stories and important lessons for everybody in the industry.
It's we were just talking about this before we started rolling. It's such a privileged position to be into, and our producers here, Claudio and Josh, to let us off the reins and just ask the questions that we want to ask and trust in us, the developers, to be able to, dive into those little nooks and crannies of the experiences of these really quite extremely talented folks that we talk to, and as you were just saying before the podcast too, it's like everyone has this unique, different story. No matter how many times we do the structure of how'd you get into games and you tell us the story, what's your first memory of a game, it always takes these beautiful twists and turns. Yeah. So, and it's a privilege being able to chat to you. I often joke about the fact that this used to be my podcast for jogging, like when I would go for a jog. And so I'd listen to Ted talking to folks or Robin back in the day, and I'd be like, okay, what's going on? And I'd get my little insights about game direction and different things. And then all of a sudden it was me doing the podcast. Exactly. And I'm like, it's a little bit too much to listen to myself while I jog. So, it's good to be here. All right. Well, look, I want to dive straight into it because interestingly, we've done the episode with you or chatted before about your past, how you got into games and your first thing. So I'm really interested to hear more about your experience with the podcast here, the later years of Insomniac, and dive into some topics that really, interestingly, you've just recently announced your retirement. Congratulations.
Thanks.
Very exciting. How long have we got in the industry now? What is it, 25, 30 years?
Oh, it's been 31 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's quite an innings.
It has been a wonderful journey, I got to tell you. It's been a lot of fun, and it went by really, really fast.
Yeah, it does, right? It's often talking about kids, they grow up so fast, but it's also studios grow up so fast, right? Yeah. Your career just goes past in the blink of an eye. I think I'm at year 18 or something now, and it's just been like a snap, and now we're here. But one of the reasons why I bring that up is because when you announced your retirement, there was just this outpouring of, first of all, congratulations, but then, talk about you as not just a leader at Insomniac, but a leader of the industry and, sort of trailblazing, whether it be in design and development and the stuff that you've done at Insomniac early in the days, but then also your, membership on the board at the AIAS. So a bunch of topics for us to cover. But I'm going to sort of dive into it first. We're just talking about the podcast. I think, do you have any standout moments from the podcast or standout guests or things that you remember, like just conversations that set you on fire running back into Insomniac? Because I remember like a lot of your episodes, you're not just talking about, even when you were firmly a studio head at Insomniac and stuff, you had a number of people, you're talking about the nitty gritty design stuff, how quest chains are developed together, in different games and things, really getting into it. Do you remember any sort of like conversations that sent you straight back to your desk and talking to everyone about the next thing that you should be doing? Or
Well, what I loved talking about was game mechanics.
Yes,
and when I way early in the early days of Insomniac, I was fortunate to be involved in game design and helping develop mechanics. And for me, that was really fun. So talking to other developers, one of my favorites is Todd Howard, who's a great friend, and talking to him about the early days and how he got involved in RPG mechanics, something that at Insomniac we only lightly touched, but hearing sort of how he and his team dealt with developing mechanics was really something that I appreciated. And I think that goes for every single developer on the show. We would, of course, talk about culture and what the team, I guess, dynamics were like at within the various teams, but ultimately we'd get to the meat of the games, things, and get into the kind of detail that I don't think you have time to get into if you're just doing a quick interview as a game is coming out. So another real benefit of, I think, this podcast is that we, the hosts, often get a chance to talk to folks after games have been out for a while, after the dust has settled a bit and people are on to their next thing, and they can talk comfortably about the lessons they learned and the techniques they used during a development. And that usually takes more time and a lot more specific questions. And I was very fortunate that every person who came on the podcast was willing to be open and share a lot of the lessons and their ideas, especially as they were evolving. They shared what the ideas they started with and how they changed along the way during development and where they ultimately ended up, which generally is very different than where they thought they would be.
Especially considering that like a lot of success stories, as we know, aren't overnight, right? Like we might get someone in and we're talking to them about their game that's been successful, but that's game 7 or 8 or 3 or 4. And so it's not just the iterations on the mechanics in that particular game, but the ones before it.
Yeah.
So another interesting element about your career is being part of PlayStation Studios as well. And like these incredible studios who obviously Insomniac was working alongside for many years as, you know, part of Sony publishing Insomniac games and working with Sony IP and things like that. But then actually being brought in as part of the family. What was that process like, and how did that feel coming into the PlayStation family and all of a sudden having this incredible access to all these? I mean, you're already getting it on the podcast and you've got these great connections, but then all of a sudden being alongside these other fantastically storied developers like Insomniac.
Well, I'm going to answer in a probably pretty obvious way. We were working with Sony for years and years, and it started back in the SPYRO days when Sony was the publisher for SPYRO, even though we were working with Universal Interactive Studios as essentially the licensor back then. And that's where we got to meet our producers like Connie Booth and Grady Hunt and many other, Chu Yoshida, people who really helped us take the game from its nascent state and help promote it globally to this audience who was really interested in a family-friendly mascot type game at the time. So beginning way back then, we kept that relationship going as we moved into Ratchet and Clank. And even though we were working with other publishers, we always had really strong connections with our friends at Sony. And then back in 2019, we were acquired by Sony, and obviously that relationship got even stronger. But even before we were acquired by Sony, we had great relationships with other first-party Sony studios like Naughty Dog and Sucker Punch and Guerrilla. And for us, just being able to speak openly to them about and sharing techniques about how we did things, how they did things was wonderful. And there weren't any barriers to those conversations, even though we were technically not part of Sony. I have always thought that the Sony philosophy about sharing and creating this sort of family-like structure was really a win for us and for the other studios.
It's amazing to hear as well that it was there in some sense before you even went, what do we got, like Facebook official, as we want to call it back in the day, right?
So to be fair, all of us and all the companies I mentioned, Naughty Dog, Sucker Punch, Guerrilla, us, we were all independent before we joined Sony. So we had already been talking. But one of the ties that bound us together is that we were all second-party developers as well. So we would see each other at all the shows and hang out together at the various Sony events. And it was really fun.
It's interesting as well, thinking about, you mentioned independent studios and obviously indie gaming, especially last year, like this past year, 2024, some of the biggest titles of the year. And it happens every so often, that they're like, well, every year, obviously there's couple of big indie hits, but it really seems like in this past year in 2024 that there's just been a number of them where they're punching well above their weight and just competing almost, in completely like commensurately with, AAA. But it's interesting thinking about these phases of indie developers. Maybe it'd be interesting to hear a little bit about that sort of independent community back then when you're working for second party. How did you guys, and now there's Discords and Slacks that indie game CEOs and stuff are on. How did you share trade secrets? When did you get together? What was that sort of indie community like back then?
Well, back in the 90s, or the late 90s, when we had already released our first games and we're just starting to get used to what it was like to be in the industry. The internet was there, but there wasn't a whole lot of sharing via internet. So it was all about face-to-face, going to conferences, and E3 actually was one of the places we saw each other most frequently, because we're all in the booths, all trying to show off our games to a big audience. And GDC obviously was another place, and eventually DICE when DICE got started. So those were the moments where we really got to connect. And through those connections, then we would follow up via email, phone, visits to each other's offices. And then eventually, as the internet became a much better place to learn from other studios, that I think helped spread more lessons that we had all learned and were willing to share with others who were just starting to enter the industry. But the indie scene was really different back then. Really different in the 90s, because there just wasn't as much available for folks. And it was cool, very cool, to see as the decades progressed, more and more small companies beginning small and staying small because they could.
Yeah.
And they could forge their own paths without having to shoot for an absolutely massive game.
Yeah. So it's interesting that you bring that up, because all of those sort of indie studios that we were just talking about that are now your colleagues at PlayStation Studios, they're titans of the industry. Was there kind of an impetus at that point in time? Because even in the mid 2000s, I remember being in the industry, and it was like there was kind of a price of entry. Like Unreal cost however much to license, and Rendware and all these things. You needed a publisher to even publish on any platform. Was there kind of an impetus to scale back then as an independent studio? Was there even the opportunity to stay small if you wanted to?
I think there was an unspoken impetus to scale because there was a lot of opportunity to compete at a very high level. And so the other thing driving us was the very quick advance of hardware, which continues to occur today. But I think that it felt back then that we were seeing generations even more frequently. Yeah. And so the demand from players to deliver something that was sort of the next level in terms of technology and visuals and audio was always there. Yeah. We always felt that pressure. And so many of us continued just to expand, which meant expanding budgets, expanding scope for our games, et cetera. Yep. And it has been possible, fortunately, to continue doing that. But today, and I know this is a big topic in the industry, games have gotten really big. And so many of the larger companies have had to think much more cogently about scope and budget and how we get more efficient with how we do things while still delivering what the players want. Yeah.
It's a huge conversation these days, especially for studios of your size. And the top end in regards to scale and scope of the industry is this sustainability of AAA and quadruple A development. I'd be interested to hear, we can talk more about that, because obviously that's in the later years of Insomniac, but it sounds like it was there sort of all along, right, is keeping those costs down.
We were appreciative of the opportunities, because if we wanted to do a game about a little purple dragon that ran around, fantastic. We had the opportunity. We had a great partner. If we wanted to take a slight detour and do a game about a little furry alien who rockets from planet to planet, Ratchet and Clank, we could do that. If we wanted to do a first-person shooter, the opportunities were there. Yes. And so we took advantage of those opportunities, and we grew.
And it's much harder to do that now, right? It's like, could you imagine, that Naughty Dog all of a sudden deciding they want to do, combat vehicular games, or, something like changing genre and pivoting now when you've got a whole tech stack and design stack and talent, the opportunities to be as agile creatively and commercially as you must have been there are different?
I don't think the agility has changed at all. I think any company who has been developing for games as a while can make the decision to jump into another genre, learn about it fast, and deliver something that players will want. Yeah. I think the risk profiles have changed significantly. Okay. If you really want to compete at the highest level in a particular genre, it does take a lot more resources. Yes. And sometimes it takes more. That includes time, people, money, and that increases risks, which comes back to what I was saying about risk profiles. So I think every single developer who has put out a few games should consider, if they want to, if they're passionate about it, switching, doing something new. I think that keeps us all engaged and excited about what we do. But at the same time, the barriers to entry into a new genre are significantly higher. And the other thing I'll say, and I'll use Naughty Dog as an example, there are developers who have doubled down on their strengths, and they've kept that flywheel going, and they've become better and better and really well known for doing a particular type of game. Yeah. And that's wonderful to see as well. Yeah. It's something we realized late at Insomniac, because we were doing all sorts of games. And ultimately, we realized that if we can focus on the story-driven character action adventures with open worlds, I'm stringing a lot of adjectives together.
No, but they're the Insomniac games of recent that you're describing for sure.
It really helps mitigate some of that risk, and it also helps your fans sort of understand what to expect and get even more excited about what you do.
And it's really interesting in this conversation about sustainability and survivability and minimizing those risk profiles as, saturation increases on storefronts and things like that. We're seeing a lot of success from studios that have done what you're saying as well. Obviously at the top end with Naughty Dog and yourselves. Something that I say to folks when talking about this stuff is that when you understand that Naughty Dog makes character-driven action games, you can kind of see how Last of Us 2 is just Crash Bandicoot 17 after all these iterations, right?
Okay.
But the interesting thing is that we're seeing that happen in the indie scene a lot as well. There are now indies who are choosing to specialize and focus on a particular genre. Like Yoast over at Galaxy Grove is doing amazing things. Brand new indie studio, and focusing on this particular aesthetic, management games, and iterating rapidly. Do you think that in your switch to sort of going, okay, we've jumped around a bit now, where we want to focus a bit more? Was it the institutional knowledge that you're able to take forward? Was it the tech stack? What were the actual really meaty benefits that you were getting from one to the next that helped you lower that risk profile? Because audience is even another one too, them knowing that they can come to you for that particular.
Well, you just answered that question for me, basically.
Okay, right.
Those three elements were really important to us.
Yeah.
And I think it's also creating developing skill sets across the entire studio, which allow team members to move more seamlessly back and forth between projects without having to stop, and relearn or learn something completely new. So for our folks, it's great to actually have developed muscles in a particular genre and then continue developing them on the next game, which isn't a completely orthogonal shift to something different, which is what we did frequently in the past. The other side of that coin, though, is that when you have a lot of completely different games, it offers more creative possibilities. But at the same time, I think it's possible for companies to be in a genre and do things that are very different within that genre, so that people can move back and forth between different worlds, different characters, while still being very familiar with and potentially experts at a set of mechanics that do play out from game to game in similar ways.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a fascinating approach, and it's amazing, and such a privilege to see it in action, from studios like your own and all the way through to the indies that I was mentioning.
Yeah.
So we're kind of talking about some seismic shifts and everything. Do you have now, looking back, with the ability to do so with your retirement announced and everything, on Insomniac and the years of Insomniac, what are sort of, would you be able to, even if it's possible, to sort of put Insomniac into sort of different eras, or are there particular like seismic decisions or shifts that you're really quite proud of throughout the course of its history?
I've never thought about that, but yes, I can make an attempt. And for those at Insomniac who feel differently, absolutely, we are all going to have different definitions of our eras. Certainly there's the startup era where we created Disruptor and learned very quickly how to make games, and also I think dealt with our first real loss. Disruptor didn't sell well. It wasn't a game that we could reasonably make a sequel from. And so when we switched to Spyro the Dragon, we were coming in with a little bit more development knowledge, but we were also jumping into a completely different genre, which was like continuing the startup phase for us, just learning on the fly. And we were lucky that Spyro did eventually start to excite players and continued just selling, which led to 2 sequels for us. And at that point, we were in basically our platform era. So we finished up Spyro with the 3rd game, realizing that we couldn't really take that character a whole lot farther with his mechanics. And we moved on to Ratchet and Clank, which was us asking ourselves, what could we do differently with platformers? So startup to the platformer era, to then I'll call it the multi-game era. At that point, we made after we released Ratchet and Clank Up Your Arsenal, we decided that we had a good opportunity to develop multiple games at once. That's when we started both Resistance, Fall of Man, first-person shooter, which was a launch title for the PlayStation 3, and Ratchet Deadlocked, which was on the PlayStation 2. And for us, we created a whole new set of muscles. We had never tried to do 2 things at once, but we felt that was really important for stability long term. And that ultimately has paid off, because we've always been a multi-game developer since back in the 2000s.
And I'll also note just quickly in there is that consistently, no matter what scale you are, that jump from a single game studio to a multi-game studio is one of the hardest that you can ever make. Yeah.
It's pretty tough. And we still today are figuring out how to do it.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. Do you remember any particular things that helped you, for studio heads that might be looking at it now or struggling with the early elements of making that leap themselves? Or are there any things that proved to have success for you in your attempt, or that you go back to today in regards to like ensuring that both teams or every team needs what they need? And
Well, we've always been fortunate to have a brilliant core team. And I say core team, this is our team that develops our engine and our tools. And we develop our own technology at Insomniac. And so our engine team was able to support multiple genres, multiple games on different platforms. And the team had been building up to that. And I know it was really hard, but their dedication and their commitment to our plan for the future was what enabled us to do what we did, and really did set us up for today, where we are today, being able to develop multiple games at once. Wow. So having a really strong tech team for us was key.
And you still have that structure today, where there's sort of like a core, almost like a tech services team that then works with the other actual game teams.
That's right. Yeah. And I again, kudos to them and to all the project managers and the managers who help make sure that all the teams are be able to talk to each other and negotiate the features that they need in a way that isn't completely making life even more difficult for the core team. So, but I mean, it's a constant. The core team will tell you it is a lot of work, but it is in some ways kind of gratifying. When I talk to core team members, they are also excited about continuing to work on different projects and develop new features for new platforms, different genres. And it's wonderful to see what they can do. It blows my mind every day.
It's amazing. We talk about privilege here, chatting on the podcast, but every time you walk into a game studio, no matter which one you're working in, we're so privileged in this industry to work with such talented, intelligent people, and from different disciplines that have different brains to you and everything. It's always been the one thing that I loved about the industry. Okay, so we've got your startup to your platformer to now your multi-game era. Would you say that continues today, or there are other?
It does, but there was a twist. So as soon as we released the Resistance series, after we had gone through Resistance 1, 2, and 3, we actually went into our multi-publisher era, where we worked with Electronic Arts, we worked with Microsoft, we worked with GameStop, while working with Sony as well. And for us, that was another sort of big step for us. We released Sunset Overdrive, Fuse. We released several mobile games with EA. We put out a Facebook game. We began working with Oculus as well. And so that phase allowed us to really develop sort of a different type of muscle, the ability to work with multiple partners at once, which again was great for us, because in today's world, it's important whether those to be able to work with multiple partners, whether they're different publishers, XDev partners, CoDev partners. We are in this industry because teams have gotten so big. There's a heavy reliance on having great relationships with outside partners.
Absolutely.
So for us, that really taught us how to I think figure out how to work with just completely different flavors of development and different desires from other groups.
Yeah, it's amazing the muscle, like you say, that you can build from that. I do was one of the things that I also hear as a studio head is, I know because we've done it ourselves, there is a double-edged sword to that, going wide. When you go mobile, different platforms, console, different partners. What is the other edge of that, or what was the other edge of that sword for Insomniac? Did you find, because also we're talking about focus, right? As well, and that later you found the need or, the benefit in focusing too. Was that a lesson that you learned through this period? Yeah.
That was probably the number one lesson we took from that era, was that while we can do a lot of different things, we probably shouldn't do a lot of different things. We probably should focus on those things that we're most passionate about and we're best at, and the ones that our fans recognize as being the most important to them. Yep. And that's where we really began pulling things back in and focusing more on the character-driven, story-driven character action games. Character action adventure games. Again, lots and lots of words strung together. Open world was important for us too.
Yeah, great. And so was that a leap? I mean, you were doing kind of open world stuff then to some degree at the start. What was the big leap at that point? Or was it actually just a refinement? There wasn't kind of a big leap into that. It was kind of, no, there's a comfier place for us where we can focus and settle in here. Well, were there difficulties there too, naturally?
I think when we began working on the Spider-Man games, when we were introduced to Marvel by our friends at Sony and got along great and dove into Spider-Man, that was the point at which we started really refocusing and working with Sony on all of our games, even though we were still independent at that point, and taking another look at what we were really good at doing. And Spider-Man was a perfect example of us taking everything that we had been all of these skills we've been developing over the last decade and pulling them together into a game that we thought showcased our strengths the best. And a good example of that was Sunset Overdrive, was a game that we released on the Xbox and was not a full open world game, but really helped us develop the kind of high action mechanics that we took over to Spider-Man. And we had continued developing our engine to support larger and larger worlds. And Spider-Man, again, brought all those things together. A better knowledge about how to build open worlds, kind of the sort of high action, high fidelity mechanics that Spider-Man exhibits, and swinging through the world and having sort of acrobatic combat. And the third was sort of the technology that could enable us to build this massive New York and have it look really good.
Yeah. I'm just like thinking about the response to the video game when it came out, and just to how much, Insomniac already being such a storied and respected studio and having so many great games out there already. And then even with that there, like how much people were blown away when Spider-Man dropped. What was that feeling like within the studio? I mean, and you at this point, you're 20 years into the studio or something like that as well.
Well, it was a moment that we had been hoping for, right? We've been working a long time to really break through. And you're really nice to say that, say those things about Insomniac. We've always felt like we're underdogs and sort of kind of scraping to show off our stuff and hope that people like us. And Spider-Man did sort of take us to another level in terms of the audience, because we're working with, I think, one of the most recognized characters in the world with Spider-Man, delivering a game that helped fulfill that fantasy for players. I think exposed Insomniac to a much larger group of players who became interested in what we did. And that was a great thing for us. It also increased the pressure on us, because we knew that any subsequent game we did would be judged on this, just like Spider-Man. I mean, we would have to deliver even more.
Right?
Exactly. But that was great, and we're really happy with and thankful for the relationship with Marvel.
Well, I actually want to talk about that for a little bit, because and I'd love to hear it from your side of the fence, because, we've had Eric on the podcast before from Marvel Games talking about, what it means, what it's like to work with such a talented studio like your own, and the sort of vetting that they go through even to work with developers to ensure that these, licenses that are cultural institutions right now are going to the right people. And one of the things that came through loud and clear from Eric and other folks that I know at Marvel Games who, chats outside of the podcast, is that you really have to prove yourself on the creative before any kind of deal making is happening or anything like that you are the people, and even down to the individual creatives at that studio, that they live and breathe Spider-Man, or they get it, or Blade, or whatever it might be. So how did you come about choosing Spider-Man? Did you say, hey, folks, put your hand up in the studio, who's your favorite Marvel character? Or how did that sort of come about, and how did you prove yourself to Marvel that you were the folks?
Well, I'll take those questions in reverse.
Yeah, cool.
We were really lucky that Connie Booth, who's a beloved producer of ours at Sony, for many, many years, introduced us to Jae-Ong and the Marvel team. And we immediately got along and realized that our philosophies about company culture, and our focus on making, being true to the characters and telling stories that had an emotional impact on players, we were totally aligned on all those things, and we knew it from the beginning. So in terms of proving things, I think it was more about just face-to-face conversations and sharing what was most important to us, and realizing that, we would probably make a really good team. Let's try this out.
Right.
And then on the character side, Marvel was great. They had a giant. Marvel has so many amazing characters.
Take your pick, right? Yeah.
And they asked us, who would you be most interested in making a game about? And I asked Insomniacs, and after some thought, we realized that Spider-Man and Peter Parker, their personalities kind of reflect who we think we are.
Oh, wow.
They try really hard to do the right thing. They don't always get it right. They make mistakes all the time. But ultimately, that interest in doing the right thing and never pushing, never stopping that push to be better, it really reflected us. So we felt a strong kind of personal connection to both Peter Parker and Spider-Man.
It's amazing you talking about the values of the team and wanting to do right and everything, because it's a perfect segue into this next part that I want to talk about, which is kind of the same question of the eras, but more about you as a leader and as like one of the, as the head of Insomniac for all of these years. Being a studio head myself of obviously a very different scale, whether it be in time and studio size, I know the immense pressures that one can be under and the different personalities in a studio, and that, like you say, trying to do the right thing and the mistakes that we make as founders, and the need for agility and change and the kind of identity crises that we go through. Like you say, working on the game design and the mechanics, and then all of a sudden you're like doing the HR payroll or something. I'd love to know how you, over so many years, like a 31-year career, like what are the TED eras, like what are the big lessons or the big shifts that you went through as a leader, and some of the lessons and mistakes and successes that you had along the way? Big question, I know.
It's a great question, and I don't think I've been asked that before, so I appreciate that. I mean, starting first of all, just overall, I've been so lucky to be surrounded by people who are amazing, right? Yeah. Skill sets that are way beyond mine, and willing to step up and lead and take on massive responsibility at the drop of a hat, and who believed in our vision, right? At Insomniac. Yeah. For me, that's what makes Insomniac go.
It takes a village.
It really does. Yeah. And you know this in games. Yeah. I mean, games is not a singular. Well, it is in some cases for singular indie creators. It's awesome, but when you're talking about large scale teams, it cannot be a singular vision. It has to be a team vision. Yeah, and that's what I think we have had from the very beginning. But going back to the beginning, I mean, the first thing I had to do was get over myself. Yeah. I mean, I have always had an ego, and I had to realize that there are a lot of people who know a heck of a lot more than I did. And a good example of that were three people who have made a big impact on me. First of all, my two partners, Al Hastings and Brian Hastings, who have been working with me for 31 years and who were willing to jump in and just go for it. And probably gave up a lot of great opportunities to do that. Yeah. And I will always be indebted to them, and there would be no Insomniac without those guys. Absolutely.
We talk about it takes a village in regards to the team, and you've got the sort of the perfect triangle of the founders as well, right? It's like League of Geeks, we were 3 founders as well, 5 at the start. And, I had a partner at one time who she ran her own company, and she was one founder, and I used to envy the agility. Like one day she opened up a pop-up in Amsterdam or something for her company. I was like, I wish I could do something like that. But then there were those moments where she would feel the pressure of some decision or some big change the company was going through. She had no one to talk to, or no one, that everything fell at her feet. And you're right, not only can we not make a game on our own, but the idea of going it alone, even as a founder or as a leader, is really, really tough. So I understand the shout out to the business partners too. Yeah.
We actually, what was really unique, and I think it's why we're still all working together today, is that the 3 of us had very different interests and very different skill sets.
Isn't it funny how that works out, right?
Yeah. While we may have argued over various game mechanics when we were much smaller, I don't think we argued over much ever. I mean, just because we all kind of found our lanes and we were comfortable in them, and we're comfortable working together as true partners versus competing. And that has been true for 31 years. I'll say another person too that made a big impact was Mark Cerny.
Yeah.
Mark. We pitched, Al Hastings and I pitched a demo of Disruptor to Mark Cerny back in 1994.
Wow.
And he was the one who actually said, yeah, we'll give you guys a shot. These are 2 guys, 0 game experience. And we did a 3-game deal thanks to Mark and with Universal. And Mark has been with us the entire time. And he really taught us, I think, how to make games early on, because again, we had no clue. And so he has been a wonderful mentor.
Yeah, he's his mate. So I work with Mark on the GDC advisory board as well, and it's just been an absolute privilege, like sitting in that room with him. And talking about like imposter syndrome, you find yourself sitting in a room arguing about or debating game design, and Mark Cerny's sitting over there. There was one point where he mentioned working on a game, professionally in his career, and I was like, I did the math. I'm like, I was not even born then. But there's something about Mark that I wanted to say, which is that it really resonates and reflects my experience with him. This idea that he would have given you a shot because his love for games is just the thing that seems to drive him like immensely, and the industry and like what we're capable of. It's infectious to be around.
He is a guy who still plays a lot, right? I mean, his knowledge of games is so deep, and it's because he keeps up with them, and he's never stopped being a player, which is awesome.
Yeah, and I mean, you've been working with him all the way through as well, right?
That's right. Another person who has made a huge impact on me is Connie Booth. Connie was a partner of ours at Sony for many, many years, and even when we were independent and when we were acquired by Sony. And just her friendship and her guidance along the way has been invaluable for me and for the rest of the team.
Yeah, and Connie's one of those names as well that if you're in the industry, comes up time and time again. But it's one of these things too where I think like obviously the broader gamer audience don't often hear about these people who are behind the scenes actually like playing such a huge role in some of their favorite games.
Yeah.
And Connie is like one that's been attached to how many of the most incredible IP and like just groundbreaking experiences that we've ever had in this industry.
Yeah.
Her name comes up time and time again.
Well, as it should. As it should. I think she's very happy to avoid the limelight.
Yeah.
But she deserves a lot of credit.
Yeah, great.
But for me, I think getting over myself early on was really important, and realizing that, hey, again, this is always going to be a team effort, and I need to listen more than stating this is how we're going to do things. And it took me a while. It actually, the point at which things really turned for me was when I was trying to be both the creative director on our games and run Insomniac. And this was in the Resistance era, around Resistance 2. And
ironically named.
Yeah.
Your Resistance as well, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I wasn't cognizant, or I wasn't admitting that I was a bottleneck and that I was holding people up because I couldn't manage to make reasonable creative decisions and do the other things that I was supposed to be doing for Insomniac, like finding our next publisher and
left and negotiating.
Right brain. And people called me out on it at Insomniac, and kudos to them, because it kind of woke me up and made me realize that I needed to make a choice. I needed to either fully embrace the creative aspects of running a game, or be the business leader that Insomniac needed and help steer the ship and make sure that other people could take the reins and do their, work their magic. And I realized that I'm not the best creative director. There are a lot of people who are even more passionate than I am and have better, much deeper skills than I do. So I'll do the business side. I'll focus on culture and do what I can to make sure that Insomniac has what it needs so that we can do the games that we want to do. And that was fulfilling in its own way.
Yes, of course. And is creative in its own way as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, the challenges are very similar in scope to the kind of challenges you hit in games. They're just different, right? They're not about, should we have a weapon wheel in this game or not, versus which publisher should we be going after, and should we jump into this genre? Yeah. So a lot of those questions were fun to tackle. I was very lucky to have a leadership team at Insomniac for many, many years, and still do, that has been side by side with me. And we've all collectively and collaboratively made these big decisions, because I do believe that when you have a lot of people and sharing their life experiences, sharing their thoughts, you end up with a better decision ultimately than if you have one person saying, this is the way it's going to be. At least that's been my experience at Insomniac.
Yeah, it's been mine too. It's funny. And the things that you're saying, even just in my, my career, I've had those moments where literally exactly the same. So I came at games as a writer, designer, and I remember the exact day and moment that I came to the decision of like, what am I doing? I can't be writing on these games anymore. Yeah. And again, it was holding up the team, and my producer, shout out Lacey at the time, was on my back about it, and rightfully so, that I was just holding up the team and I couldn't do it anymore. And that admission set me free as well, right? And then I was able to serve the team in a different way, and I found the creativity in, as you say, like supporting the team, building the culture, making those different kind of decisions.
Right. Yeah. And that's a good point too. I mean, I talk about, I think we both realize the importance of having the entire team involved in big decisions, or as many people as you can, but ultimately somebody does have to make the call.
Yes.
And that is that is the job, our job. And it's often not a fun job, because you're never going to make everybody happy. Yeah. Right. You're going to make a decision, and a significant portion of the company is going to disagree with it. And it's your job to make sure that you can get everybody moving in the same direction, even if there is disagreement. And if you make a mistake, well, you're the one responsible for it, and you have to explain how you're going to get out of this because you made that call. Yeah. And that, and in some ways that is a fun challenge. And I found I did that a lot at Insomniac. I made a lot of mistakes, and I got us into situations where we had to extricate ourselves. But at the same time, I actually found some sort of gratification in explaining that I made a mistake. Yeah. And I think that's, I just know from being on the other side and working at maybe one other company before Insomniac, that when your leaders are human and are willing to admit their mistakes and to explain their reasoning, but that they're also willing to change, that does a lot for the company culture
Yeah.
because leaders have to be accessible. Leaders have to be
and accountable,
and accessible and accountable and willing to entertain ideas and talk to people as humans, right? And frankly, I see that all the time in the industry. I think it's a really good thing about our industry.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I think sometimes, like, obviously we have a lot of growing up to do and cleaning up to do in the industry, but there are many ways in which I think we do lead in like leadership and other things. And this is definitely one of them, I think, in some ways. But what we're ultimately talking about is also, in another way to put it, is transparency too, is an interesting thing here. And it's very clear that you've been a very transparent leader in the way that Insomniac operates, even just in what you're telling us today. But from the outside, you can see it. And this is something, the nitty gritty of like, what and where and how to be transparent with your team and the different, levels of folks within your team and everything. Is there some kind of framework or lessons that you've learned in regards to transparency with your team? Because I think everyone knows about the benefits that can come from being transparent with your team. But I think a lot of leaders, even storied leaders, can sometimes still struggle with, especially when you're working with sensitive IP or other parties that you may not have the privileges of being as transparent with your team. Is there something that you've learned along the way as sort of like a guiding hand for helping you understand how and when to be transparent with your team?
Well, I try to be transparent 100% of the time. The only time I really can't be is if there is hardware that we are that a few people are disclosed on and I can't share because I've signed an agreement where I can't share. But we at Insomniac, we really do share everything where we don't hide or hold back on any details about the various games that are being made and decisions we're making or our long-term plans, even if those plans change. And I've realized over the years that if you blow smoke, people know it, right? Everybody who joins a developer is generally very, very smart, and people don't like being talked down to. I don't like being talked down to. I don't want a leader to tell me, "Yeah, don't worry, we got this." I want to know what is the plan, and if you don't have a plan, that's okay. Tell me how we're going to get to a plan, and allow me to share my ideas so that I can feel ownership. I mean, that's how I feel. So I want Insomniacs to feel exactly the same way. Thus, we share what we're doing, and we do it in a lot of different ways. We have office hours where we invite people to talk openly about whatever they want with my team, the senior leadership team. We have office hours for the projects. We have lots of open project meetings where anybody can join. I do a daily AMA, Ask Me Anything, where I answer some pretty pointed questions about, could be culture, could be plans, could be why we did something that people aren't happy with. So it all comes from, and in some ways, trying to do what I think is the right thing. And what I think a lot of leaders at Insomniac believe is the right thing. Like share your thoughts, share your ideas.
I think the proof is obviously in the pudding. And I want to say I practice the exact same thing. And when you say this to folks, it can seem, especially other leaders, it can seem incredibly radical to some people to just share everything.
Well, there's a risk. I'm cutting you off.
No, please do. Yeah.
I've experienced this frequently. You can give people whiplash, right? So
Yes,
when you
great
say,
point.
we're going to do this and here's why, and then next week you change because of some other thing that happened that you didn't expect, then people go, well, what? Do they know what they're doing? Why? Why are you changing? But I would rather err on the side of transparency than hold things back. Because it gives everybody the chance to see that what exactly it is that you're doing. Because the people who join your team have decided to join your team. Like they're there because they want to be there, and they believe, I think, generally they believe in where you're going. So it's important to show people where the company's going and give them a voice in that. Sorry, I cut you off.
No, please. I love it. That's so you're the guest. This is your opportunity. You can cut me off as much as you want. And it's a fantastic answer. It's something as well that I find transparency is a long-term decision as well. As leaders, we sometimes make short-term decisions, but we're trying as much as possible, I find, to make the long-term plays and like thinking about what's the right long-term decision here. Transparency seems like one of them. And I think it can reflect in the team too, where you might see new people or especially some juniors come along and join the company and you're telling them things about like, hey, we've actually only got this much runway in the bank. And they go, oh my God, they freak out. But then when you've got someone next to them that's been with you for 10 years, they're able to be like, no, it's okay, because they've seen the actual delta over time and the transparency, it builds that trust, right? Like trust is small promises kept over time, I think.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
Trust is small promises kept over a long period of time. That's a great statement.
Yeah. So we've spoken about this notion of, and I will say to you that, we do some research for the podcast, and when talking to different people who've worked with you and things over the past, humility was one that came up. So I think you definitely were able to get through that period of getting over yourself, like you say, it's success, right? Congratulations early on. But what about in the later years? Because I mean, Insomniac's gone through some amazing and wonderful changes, not just obviously with the games, but like new leadership with Sony, and then obviously the scale of the studio and things like that. What about the later Ted Prices, or what were some of the transitions or your skill sets or big admissions that you had to make later in the years of Insomniac?
Well, admissions, I mean, I'm admitting that I screwed up in a lot of places. I mean, we have many games that we've built that haven't been successes. And I think being able to analyze why the games weren't successful, or why the decisions I made or we made as a company weren't the right ones, has been really important. So we tend to be pretty introspective as a company, and we don't shy away from doing postmortems, which I think a lot of companies do, but doing our best to put actions in place that demonstrate that we've actually learned our lessons. And we recently, after shipping Spider-Man 2, we made some big changes in our production pipeline as a result of people on Spider-Man 2 saying, hey, these things didn't go so well. There were some problems that we need to fix. And it was great. And this happens after every game, but we had a really nice opportunity to change some big aspects of our production pipeline. And doing so was a risk.
Yes, of course.
But these ideas came from the team. They weren't coming from me or my immediate team members. And what was awesome was that they didn't work as well as we hoped they would at first, but we've continued to tweak them as people have given us feedback and said, well, I like this, I don't like this. Let's try something different. So that introspection and that constant willingness to improve ourselves, I think it's not unique to Insomniac. I think most developers have to do this. But for us, it's just become a way of life. We're always analyzing. We're always asking, how can we do this better? How can we? And what do you think? What do you think? What should we try? Obviously, you can go too far, right? We're all of us are under production deadlines. We have specific constraints that we have to work within. So experience is useful in deciding how far we should go with certain changes and how long we should continue going down a certain path before we say that didn't work. Yeah. And I think that's a benefit of having been around this company, Insomniac, having been around for 30 years. We know a lot more about how long to try something before we say, okay, let's stop. We still make plenty of mistakes where we do let things go too long, but we're getting better every time. So it's a constant work in progress. I know I'm kind of going all over the place here. No,
it's great.
But that's what makes it fun, I think, for all of us. It's just a journey just doesn't stop changing, and it stays fresh because the industry keeps changing, and the fans keep demanding different things, and the hardware changes. So we're always solving problems, which I think is what we've been trained to do as gamers from the very beginning.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. Now, you just mentioned fun and like how incredibly attractive that dynamic environment of games can be. But it's also, as we've seen within the industry recently, it can be an incredibly tumultuous place for people in regards to job security and things like that. And even sometimes the quality of their jobs or their experience. But one thing that, like, I don't know how many Best Places to Work awards Insomniac has won over the years, but it's something I remember before I was even in the industry, I was well aware of all the way from Melbourne, that was one of the ways in which Insomniac was excelling, not just in the games that they were making, but in the kind of environment that they were building for people. Now, we've obviously spoken about a bunch of things that may contribute to that, but if I was to ask you specifically why you think, or what you think has created the success that you and your founders and your leadership team have created in regards to making Insomniac such a great place to work, specifically for people to come and just enjoy their work so much.
I'm going to try not to be redundant here, because I do think it's a couple things we talked about. I think having a commitment to collaboration and transparency has been really important for us. And because we started incredibly small and then just slowly grew, it's been relatively easy to keep that in place and to have values that have remained consistent over the years. Another thing I think, though, that has helped us is to have a vision for which we actually didn't put in place until relatively recently. But we realized that for decades we were making games because we were passionate about something in particular, and we were passionate about having a lasting and positive impact on our players. And we kind of, I remember when we were in a difficult position, and we were trying to get everybody on board with, hey, let's try to head the same direction this time. and we realized it wasn't about the games we were making. It was more about the impact that the games had. And so after a couple of failed attempts, we came up with a vision statement that helped everybody start making decisions a little bit more consistently and asking, well, if we do this type of game, or if we do this in our game, are we going to have a positive impact on players? Is this going to send a positive message in some way? And that helped steer a lot of the decisions that we made along the way. So that's helped with our culture.
Yep.
And it's also helped with our policies. When we think about, what do we want to do to have a lasting and positive impact on Insomniacs, which was just as important as having a lasting and positive impact on our players, it steered us, we thought, in the right direction for ensuring that people could come to Insomniac and feel heard, take ownership of the games, and if they have problems, not feel afraid to speak up and say, hey, we should fix this.
Yeah.
We're not perfect. I mean, I'll be the first to admit that. There are plenty of issues that we are constantly dealing with, but we've really tried hard over the years to build that kind of culture from the very beginning.
I want to share a moment with you that happened in 2016 where, from the other side of the globe, I think you really showed me what it meant to be a leader in some ways. And that was, Trump had just got voted in for the first time, and there was the immigration ban that was happening in regards to Muslims, the quote-unquote Muslim ban that was happening. And I remember being in the studio, and you had released a video where you stood up in front of all of your Insomniacs, the studio there, and you sent out a message and you spoke on behalf of your team and the importance of the moment for you and what it meant to have Insomniacs from all around the world and different cultures and the actual impact and the hurt that those kind of things could create. Now, we're obviously living in a bit of a politically tumultuous time, not just in the States, but around the world. Considering that you've had to make those decisions, I mean, that's just one that I've spoken about, but I'm sure internally you've had to go through different moments in time, whenever it may be, where you've had to talk to your team and stuff. How do you have any sort of advice for leaders navigating this new political environment, or when you feel it's time for a company to sort of lift their head up from making games and say, make a political statement to support their team or their players? Or how did you navigate that moment, and how have you navigated them since going forward?
I think having open conversations with your team, we had a lot of town halls where we discussed topics that weren't necessarily game development topics, where we discussed how people felt about what was happening in the world and whether we should make a statement. That has always been important at Insomniac. So my suggestion is to create a safe place, a place where your team members feel comfortable sharing their views in a respectful way, right? I mean, because it can get out of control where if team members are sharing views that others don't share, and they're doing so in a toxic way, it can create a hostile situation. Yeah. So we try really hard to help Insomniacs understand how we can share our ideas, even if we come from completely different backgrounds and have completely different ideologies, share them in a way that's constructive and gives each other the benefit of the doubt so that we feel safe with each other. And ultimately from those conversations can come who we are and what we want to speak out on. And we've spoken out frequently on what we believe are human rights issues throughout our 30-year and more towards the latter half of our existence as social media became much more influential in our lives. Yeah. But it's something that we haven't shied away from. And it's difficult. Let me just say,
most important things are, right? Yeah.
I'm going to say internally, it can be very difficult because especially in today's very divided world, people have a lot to say. And so we try to balance things and again, create a safe space for people to share their ideas. There are some people who will not want to share their ideas and that's important and fine. There are some people who want to focus explicitly on the games. Yeah. Just let's focus on making the games. So that's great too. So that as you grow, that becomes even more difficult to navigate to ensure that everybody feels comfortable with the conversations they can have, the conversations they are having, and what the company is representing publicly.
It's all hard. Part of understanding yourself as a company as well, right?
Yeah,
and that's not just the game's visions, but where the company's visions and values are.
And that comes back to accessibility again. I think that the leaders in a company have to be accessible. They have to take the time to talk to individuals across the company, share ideas openly, understand how their team feels at any point about anything. Yeah. That makes you a better company, I think. But it's hard to do because it takes a lot of time and it can also be really stressful for leaders.
Yeah. And it is that long-term, that long-term decision or long-term benefit that we're talking about as well. So the investment upfront, sometimes you don't see the fruits of that labor, of those small promises for a very long time. But I imagine when you go through those difficult times like you have at Insomniac, that's where we went through a very difficult time recently at League of Geeks. And the interesting thing was, even though as a leader, we're responsible for those difficult times, it was also strangely one of the moments where I felt most capable as a leader, and like the ways in which we had led had been proven out because of the way that the team rallied together and responded to the bad news and the crisis because of the transparency and because of the trust that we'd built. And, it's like leadership is a bank that trades on trust, right?
Yeah.
And so you have these moments where you can draw down a huge amount because you have to. You're like, okay, I got to draw down a bunch of trust, but you've been building it up over time.
That's a great point. There is sort of that bank of trust that it comes in handy when you have to make really tough decisions.
Yeah.
I think also too, just going along with these difficult conversations is never forgetting to explain the why, right? And we talked about this a little bit before, but it's really easy to forget how important it is to make a decision and just move on, right? Because we're all moving at 1,000,000 miles an hour.
Yep.
But when we can take the time to just say, let me explain things fully for you. So even if you disagree, at least you know why we did what we did. Because again, in a large company, you're never going to get 100% agreement on anything.
Yeah.
You have to make the call, but people have to be comfortable. People will be much more comfortable if they understand that you weren't insane when you decided to do the thing you did. Right?
Exactly.
And you would listen to other people so that you, even if you were insane, you were at least directed in the...
they got to know the method behind the madness, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Totally. Okay, well, really incredible to hear about Insomniac and all these years. And I mean, we could do 10 podcast episodes as well. But I do want to say, you're not just retiring from Insomniac, you're retiring from video games in your whole new chapter of your life. Very exciting and happy for you.
Thank you.
But I want to give you a moment to reflect, not just on Insomniac, and it's totally fine to bring up some things from Insomniac because it's been a huge part of your life, but let's go back and just, are there any sort of watershed moments, things that you're significantly proud of or great moments from your career in games that come to mind over 31 years?
Well, it's hard not to say anything about Insomniac.
No, go
because
for
my
it.
my life has been Insomniac.
Yeah.
I mean, that's been where I've lived for 30 years. And I'll just say that I'm really happy to see that this industry continues to be introspective. And even though we have plenty of problems to fix continually, the industry is not afraid to speak up and say, hey, let's discuss these things openly. And I think DICE actually is a great place. I'm not trying to, because we're here at DICE, I'm not trying to plug DICE. And because I've been involved with DICE, I'm not trying to plug it.
Too. That's fine. Yeah.
But what I love about this conference and other conferences in the industry is that people who work in the games industry aren't shy about sharing their thoughts, their solutions, and their hopes. And that, I think, keeps this industry vibrant and invites more people in. I think it makes it a very an industry that embraces newcomers, that is obviously embraces newcomers, because we admit we need new ideas constantly, or we wither. And that means that we're generally very open to folks who raise their hand and say, hey, I got something different to talk about, or here's an issue, I got a great solution for it, or ask the question, have we been paying enough attention to sustainability, or ensuring that this industry we have great representation in this industry. And I love it when people bring up those topics because they're important to us at Insomniac, but as an industry, it demonstrates that we're being responsible, even if we don't get it right every time.
Absolutely. I think, you brought up the roundtables. It's a great example of it, right? You can have some young indie developer sitting at a roundtable with the head of some VC firm and then a game director from a PlayStation studio or something, and everyone's kind of just talking openly and can challenge each other on their various viewpoints or what they see the next steps for the industry being.
Roundtables are such a great example because I think that it reminds me, at least, that we all kind of started in the same place.
Yes.
We all started with zero idea how to make games, and it's often nice to sit next to somebody who has a lot more experience in that field.
Yeah, I learn so much. It's just such an incredible opportunity to sit down with those people. And I think the Chatham House rules as well that the roundtables have of being able to just speak openly and, the confidence that you can walk away from that table and it stays at that table is just really quite liberating.
Yeah.
Another hallmark of your industry has been actually with the AIAS, not just on the podcast, but on the board.
Yeah.
So I'm really excited to sort of hear some of your thoughts about the Academy and your time with the Academy and how it has evolved and changed throughout time, and not potentially like the eras or anything, but what are some of the takeaways that you've had from the Academy and the great work that it's done or the challenges that it's faced throughout its time?
Well, I think that the Academy has stayed true to its mission of recognizing the craft in the industry. I think that has been a guiding principle, and the Academy has never stopped doing that. It's just come up with better ways to do it. And DICE is a great example of that because the Academy didn't start with DICE. I think it was Rich Hillman long ago on the board who said, hey, you know what? We should consider a conference where we get all of the industry's leaders together and creative heads and talk openly about some topics that you just don't hear at other conferences. Yeah. And it was that moment where I think the Academy took a big step, it evolved significantly from what it was before, which was having the Game Awards, to something that now has really elevated it in terms of presence within the industry. So I got to say, it's fun to talk to people who have been to decades of DICE and I'll say, and see them again and again, and look forward to what they're going to share this time around, having had another year of experience in the trenches or leading teams. That to me makes DICE so much fun. The Academy is a nonprofit organization. It is it exists because of generous donations from companies across the industry and partners within the industry, and because of the incredible Academy team who works tirelessly to put on events like DICE, and Megan Scavio's leadership. Megan's been awesome. And board members who are willing to devote their time as well to helping the Academy move forward and ask what's next. So I've been really fortunate to be a part of it for so long, and have some of my best friends in the industry on the Academy board. Yeah, I will miss them all.
It's not that I'm going to
stop talking to people, but
He's moving to Nepal. He's out of here. Yeah,
it's been an honor to be involved and see how the Academy continues just to go from strength to strength.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the Academy. Let's talk more broadly about the industry, because not just through the Academy, but also your time at Insomniac, and obviously all the people that's enabled you to interface with. And you've no doubt, I imagine, got this incredible amount of wisdom. And even though you're departing from the industry and moving on, I'd love to know what your hopes are for the industry and where you see it going.
My hope is that this continues to be an industry where people can join and share their ideas openly without any fear of being looked at oddly or shut down. I think that's what makes this industry go. People just feeling comfortable and welcome, raising their hands and saying, I got a better way.
Yeah.
I think that's what we need. Yeah. Because games are such a vibrant art form. Games evolve and we need it. And it is what sets, to me, it's what set games apart from any other art form. We don't stop changing. And as a result, though, you can't stop asking for ideas from folks who join the industry, or encouraging people to join the industry who bring in fresh approaches. That's what keeps us going and keeps us, as I said before, from stagnating.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Is there a particular... Actually, I'm just really excited. Oh, honestly, I would love to just jump into some game chat with you. Let's just bring it down a touch. And you were saying that you're playing Caves of Cud at the moment. All right, let's talk about that. How did you come across, because this is my game of the year as well from 2024. We just did the episode with Jason and Brian from Freehold. Tell me about your card experience so far.
Well, it's recent because I've been excited about Civ 7 because I'm a Civ fan, and I was reading an early review and it mentioned Caves of Cud, and I'd heard Insomniacs talking about it. We have lots of internal Slack channels, and on one of the channels, people will share their ideas for games. And Caves of Cud was one that Insomniacs were raving about, but I just hadn't gotten a chance to play it. So I checked it out, downloaded it, and it immediately reminded me of Ultima 3. And I only say this because of the graphics, not because of the mechanics. Yeah. But it took me back to a point in my life where just those simple Apple IIe-esque graphics really just blew, just sparked so many ideas because they were simple and they have the player kind of recreating what's going on in your head. It gives you just enough to sort of build this fantasy that is your own special fantasy without kind of overloading you with too many graphics, which I'm very used to.
And responsible for as well. Too.
Exactly. And I like that too.
Yeah, it's
but
great.
This really transported me back. And of course, the game mechanics themselves being so, I mean, it's a roguelike, but it isn't a roguelike. So having the chance to sort of play how I want to and discover something new all the time and surprising with just the different builds that you can create and the different loot that you can pick up and the stories, the lore in the game was really impressive.
Yeah, it's really amazing to me how seamlessly they seem to have merged and really gotten the balance right of procedural content and generative content and possibilities, and then the absolutely bespoke like prose and storytelling and the path that they put you on through the game. And it's just it's one of those games that I think I said in a post recently on Blue Sky when I was tweeting out it's not tweeting, whatever you want to call it, posting on Blue Sky about the episode that we did. It really, like, there was no game in 2024 that left my jaw on the floor as much as CUD, whether it be because I'm sniped across the map from some enemy that I never saw, or like the way in which the game is just executed. It's in 17 years they were working on that game.
You know, that is an accomplishment, and maybe you should definitely that's a good story right there, right? Yeah, 17 years.
Yeah, we had 2.5 hours to try and cover that. So it took me 4.5 with Tarn and Zach from Bay 12.
Wow.
But let's obviously we've heard a lot and seen a lot of the games that you've been making, but let's talk more about your gaming interests. What are you usually playing? How have they evolved over the years? What games are you into, Ted?
I've been on a strategy game kick for the last year or so. Just because I've been so busy with everything, I haven't had the time to really get sucked into the big story-driven games that I tend to play. Yeah. So I mentioned Civ, Stellaris I went back to, which I had a lot of fun. And that game has continued to evolve over the years, which is really kind of very cool.
Yeah, it's great to see that.
Yeah, I think Humankind is another fun one. And there are a whole bunch of them. But those are the games that when I'm eating lunch, I can just sit down and play a few turns, and then I can go back to work and not feel like I just spent 4 hours completely, having fun, but ignoring what I really should be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. It allows you to dive in and dive out. I have to give you a key for Solim Infernum as well after this.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Great. Okay. So, but you were saying you usually are playing like the bigger sort of like story-driven sort of action-adventure stuff?
Yeah. I mean, I'll certainly play all the big ones that come out and do my best to get through them. I don't always have the time. And and these days I'm a little bit more picky. Mm-hmm. So if there's a mechanic that trips me up, or I start to feel like it's becoming a grind, I'll probably stop. And I wouldn't have done that 10 years ago. But like most of us, as we age, we realize that time is precious. Yeah. And if we're going to do something, it's got to be great. And I think that's probably reflected in how much care and attention teams put into these games today that do hit the 90s, the high 80s and 90s. Like that, the game quality today of those top tier games is just staggering. But it's required because the gaming population, I mean, a lot of us, now, you and I might be a little older than you. I think I might be a little older than you.
Little. Yeah.
My generation is definitely one of the first that grew up with games.
Yes.
And so
yes, absolutely.
As we age, we're still playing games, right? Yeah. But I think we probably have a little less patience. And so I think that puts more pressure on game developers to ensure that the game from the very beginning to the end is engaging. And that is hard to do.
Yeah. How do you feel about, there's been a lot of talk, for many years now about the size of some of these games, especially the quadruple AAA games. And there is really, we can feel it within the industry, this wave of, Gen Z, Gen Alpha gamers that are coming through that have very different gaming habits and places they've grown up playing things like, these games that are platforms essentially, like Fortnite. Kids that started playing Fortnite that were like, 12 or whatever when it first came out, and now 20 or something, right? It's like, it's quite amazing to say that, but they're now paying customers on Steam or other things. And so the types of games that they play and the types of experiences they had are very different to the ones that you and I had growing up, where we're getting console games with the Nintendo seal of approval on them or something. What do you feel about the future of these big, larger games? Do you feel through your time in the industry that there is always going to be a space and a place for the larger, big 100+ hour experiences and the smaller things? Or do you feel it sort of moving and shifting around?
I don't think it has to be a 100+ hour experience. And I say this is me being really biased because we don't make 100+ hour games at Insomniac, but I enjoy them. Elden Ring is a great example of a game that I will always go back to because I love it. And it's crafted with such precision and such love. You can see it. And I feel like I can just scroll through it in my head. It's so every part of that game is so unique. You can run
the simulation, right? Yeah.
So I can come back to it, even if I've taken a break and I've only put 60 hours into it. I can always come back. And then there are other games that I love. I will play from end to end because it's a 10, 15 hour experience that gives me what I want, which is a strong story-driven experience where I'm on the emotional arc with the characters. I feel like I've got a satisfied ending, and I walk away feeling like that impacted me emotionally in some way.
Yep.
That's a lot of what we try to do at Insomniac. But there are a lot of other games out there that do that as well. I think Naughty Dog's games are a good example, Sucker Punch's games. And at the same time, then there are the live service games, the multiplayer games, which I love as well. And I'm not these days, I don't play as many as I used to, but those games will always be in existence. So kind of going back to answer your that was sounding patronizing. Of course, they'll be those games have been dominating for a long time, and it's I love seeing whatever the next live services game, multiplayer game is, because I'll definitely try it out and see if it hooks me. But going back to what you asked about, will these story-driven sort of almost singular experience of games continue? I think they will, and I think that we as humans have a need to have that kind of entertainment. I mean, if you look at movies, blockbuster movies have been around forever. And it's because I think we want that emotional, that hit, if you will, that impact, to feel something. And I think that these often the single character AAA action games and the indie games as well, which are single player and just focus on a story, give us what we want as players. At the same time, we want to go play with our friends. We've got amazing multiplayer games. So that's one of the things I love about this industry. It's really just gone like this.
Yeah, the diversity of opportunity and, in the industry in regards to what you can play is huge.
Yeah. And at the same time, the audience has done the same thing, right? And that's really great for everybody. It's a sort of it's been a symbiotic thing forever.
Yeah, someone was talking last night at dinner, just, chatting about different stuff, and they mentioned how, the success of the Wii was even just a big boon for PlayStation and others, because it brought in a whole new generation of gamers that then elevated, or not elevated, but, as they grew up and they wanted something different or a more, realistic, or like, what's the word I'm looking for? You know what I mean? Like the next degree
closer
of fidelity.
To reality, right?
Thank you. The next degree of fidelity, or a larger experience than your Wii sort of games that you're playing with your family. And I think that's happened throughout the industry all the time. And I agree with what you're saying too. I asked the question, but it's my perspective too. There's really interesting, if you look through the industry and the stuff that we've been through. I remember when mobile free-to-play came through and everyone was like, this is the future. Like, oh my God, what's going to happen to all these? And it's like, no, it just becomes its own thing. And we're still over here making these, however, same with indie grows. And it's just the market shares may change slightly and move around, and that's always dynamically moving, but the industry keeps growing, and the different experiences that we're able to just constantly come up with is just quite profound.
I really appreciate you saying that, because it is at the end of every console generation, at least, you've got pundits saying, last one, or PC games are dead, or free-to-play games are dead, or whatever it is. And you're right. It just, what's nice is that players, I think, are always looking for a great experience, right? It doesn't matter in many cases what platform it's on, or what its genre is, or what its monetization scheme is. We just want to go out there and either have fun with our friends, have fun by ourselves, do something that kind of helps take us away from the daily grind often.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really quite wonderful to see. And the time that we spend in the industry, the longer that you recognize these cycles and things. I mean, who would have guessed in 2002 or 2003 the market share that PC would have these days, right? Like we thought it was going out, and now here we are, and it's just dominating in such an incredible way with Steam and the other platforms now available. Interesting. Okay, now there is one other thing that I want to dive into, which is you mentioned before about this notion of like games in their 90s and everything, but there is a very distinct thing that happened with Insomniac recently, which is you getting games in the 90s and everything, right? It's like this universal acclaim that Spider-Man received, and then you've gone on to, repeat with the subsequent ones. Tell me how, and you've mentioned as well in the studio about how it felt like you were kind of the underdogs for a long time, and not just in, game quality, but in audience, like you hit this next echelon, but it's clearly there as well in the quality of experiences that you've done. So was there some kind of secret sauce or something that clicked at some particular time, or what contributed to that? Was it just this momentum for all these years that came together at once?
Well, I think it's a desire from every team member to deliver something that is going to stand the test of time with players. No question about it. We've been shooting for that forever. I think getting more and more familiar with the Spider-Man universe and the mechanics, and striking a balance between what players loved and doing something slightly, that elevated it, was a key to that. But the team made the decision to go for it and take some risks with the mechanics and the size and what we were delivering. And we were really happy and gratified that players and reviewers felt the same way. So,
all right. Ted, do you think that you would change anything if you could go back? If you had the little remote that, from that Adam Sandler movie where you could just click back and go to like any point in time, does something come to mind? Or is it like, no, let the chips fall as they did? We
it's
learned
funny.
the lessons.
When I was in my 20s, I would have these dreams about going back to when I was younger and having and being a better athlete or being smarter or whatever it was, and thinking how I could dominate. And I've come to realize that everything does happen for a reason. And I can look back at every single one of our stumbles at Insomniac, and it has ultimately led to something bigger and better at the end. And maybe it's because we learned an important lesson. Maybe it's because it gave us a chance to develop technology that we wouldn't have developed otherwise. Maybe we were able to develop a relationship with an outside partner that we would have never met had we not made a particular stumble.
Yeah.
So no, I wouldn't change anything. I mean, it has been an amazing journey for me, and I'm really blessed to have met every single Insomniac who has joined us over these last 31 years and worked side by side with them. It's been
what a pleasure.
It is. Yeah, I've been very, very fortunate.
Yeah. It must be like, now let's talk a little bit about the retirement. It must be such a bittersweet thing, right? Like it's so hard earned, and it's so incredible that you have this opportunity to do so, and take a step away from games and focus on new things in your life. How did you come to that decision? How do you arrive at something like that? I imagine it's something you've been working on for a long time, succession plans and having this as a goal. Can you talk us a little bit about that process and emotionally and logistically?
Well, making the decision to ultimately retire is something that was a hurdle I had to get over.
Another one, right? Even late in the game, they're still coming.
Yeah. So I had to realize that it's something that would be a good step for me and a good step for Insomniac. And I say that because we have leaders at all levels who are constantly stepping up.
Yeah.
And I felt it was important for the company's long-term success to have fresh leadership in place who have their vision for where we should go that matches what Insomniac's vision is currently, but could bring in new ideas. Like I said, I feel like if we stagnate, if we stop evolving, that's not a good thing. So I felt like it was important for me to make space for others. And a good way to do that is to exit and to retire. And I didn't want to go halfway either. I think there's always the opportunity to stay on as an advisor or to be available, but I know that I wouldn't want anybody doing that. If they handed the reins to me and said, hey, you guys got it, but guess what? I'm going to weigh in on these decisions every now and then. That would drive me crazy. So I felt it was important to make just a clean break and make sure that Insomniac was in great hands, which it will be with Chad Dezern and Jen Huang and Ryan Schneider, who are longtime Insomniacs, who are been part of my team, well trusted, super respected by every Insomniac, and are going to take us again further than I could. So that excites me.
Yeah, we've obviously been talking about you and your retirement, but it's such a fantastic gift for the Insomniacs as well. It's ultimately the parting gift, right? Is to like step right out and let them go on and have this whole new era. There's an era that we didn't get to talk about that you don't know what it's going to be. We don't know what it's going to be. It's so exciting.
I'm very confident about it, though, and it's what was important also is continuity and stability for Insomniacs. Yes. And again, Ryan and Chad and Jen have been at Insomniac for a long, long time. They have been leading the charge in their areas and have stepped up over the last year, really, to do much more of what I do. So the transition itself was intended to be smooth, so that Insomniacs wouldn't wake up one day and go, "Oh, wait, somebody else is running Insomniac." It was the point was let's make this almost a non-event so that we can stay focused on what matters, and that's the games.
Yeah, it's like a relay race. You want the smoothest possible handover, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, so on your way out the door, not just from Insomniac, but from the rest of the industry, if there was some kind of parting wisdom or lessons that you could pass back if you got a chance now to, and again, I know big questions, but like to rapid fire some wisdom on the industry or things that you would hope for the industry. Obviously, you've spoken about the continued curiosity and things like that, but any lessons?
Oh my gosh. Any lessons, any specific lessons? I think it again comes back to, as leaders, being accessible, and making sure that everybody does have a voice and understands why decisions are being made. I think when we can do that consistently as leaders, the industry is better.
I love it. It's beautiful. And you know, like I said, I've done my research, and it's funny. I asked you for the lessons and you summed up something so simple and so short, but it really reflects everything that everyone said about their time with you, whether it's on the AIAS board or working with you in the industry, or even just as a partner that they've worked with you in the past. It's just incredible to hear of your success and the impact that you've had on others.
Well, you're really nice. Thank you.
You're also going to be the recipient of the Lifetime Achievement Award as well.
Hall of Fame.
No, Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
Sorry, Hall of Fame.
Don James gets the
Don. Yes, that's right. I got them mixed up. But congratulations,
Thank
Hall
you.
of Fame. It's absolutely incredible. Now, my final question is, and again, you can choose not to answer this if you want because it's personal. You're out of games, but what is Ted going to do with his time after games? Are you going to fish off the coast of some little jetty in Portugal? Are you going to spend more time with the family, hike some mountains? What's the...
I should speak about I love how you use the third person with me. I should speak in the third person. Ted is going to. No, I do a lot of volunteering in the STEM space, STEM education space in Tennessee where I live. And I will be continuing to focus on that. Maybe take up some other projects that are engineering and science focused, nothing to do with games.
Yep.
And I will be playing games. I'm looking forward, and I've said this to a few other people, I cannot wait to pick up a controller and play games without looking for bugs. I really. That is
without peeking behind the curtain, right?
Yeah, it's hard to break one's, to break that habit, because for 30 years, whenever I play a game, there's certain things I've been looking for in our own games for so long, it's hard not to notice them when you play games, but I'm going to try to train myself out of that.
Well, Ted, best of luck with that. Thank you for this episode. Thank you for everything you've done for the industry, not just in Insomniac and leading the way for leaders like myself and, obviously your folks there, but your work on the board and outside of that advocacy that you've done for the games industry. I think obviously the Hall of Fame award speaks for itself, but you have left the industry in a better place than when you joined it, I believe, for being here.
You're giving me way too much credit, but I appreciate you saying that. That's really nice.
Yeah, take it. All right. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.